Okay, Mark Twain versus Christian Science and Empire. Also, I wrote most of this, I wrote notes towards this while I was here in 2022, so like 16 months ago or so. So thank you so much for letting me come stay in Quarry Farm for a week. It was a wonderful experience. That might explain the somewhat dated nature of the first reference, which is at least like a couple of years dated. So during a pivotal moment of the tension in the 2021 Netflix TV show, The Chair, a workplace comedy about a fictional English department, a younger black faculty member quips, "When you're untenured, you read the bylaws." But why doesn't everyone read the bylaws? The line demonstrates the savvy of one character versus the obliviousness of most to their own institution's workings. It also implies larger questions about the value of the humanities degree. If only one of the members of this elite body of scholars knows their own bylaws, then can the study of literature actually train us at better understanding, let alone navigating or critiquing the social forms we encounter in daily life? Because that has been the claim from some formalist critics like Caroline Levine, Anna Kornblow, Caroline LeJac, some of whom we heard about earlier. In a broad sense, the affirmative answer is what these critics contend. Given the analogy between literary and social structures, a training in the analysis of literature can help us critique, build, or historicize social or political forms. So then why does the chair's satire of most professors' obliviousness to the bylaws strike us as spot on? I'm generalizing, but likewise, why are the majority of examples applying close reading to daily life so abstract, analogous, or retrospective? Macro instead of micro, global capitalism instead of boardroom procedure. From Raymond Williams and Lionel Trilling through to the 21st century new formalist, this profession loves its big ideas and seems to want to move too quickly to concepts. Mark Twain's late nonfiction treatise, Christian Science, published in 1907, returns us to the bylaws. This underappreciated Twain text serves as a prime example of the way that an astute literary analysis enables organizational critique. Our profession's distaste for even reading bylaws explains in a large part the lack of scholarship on, and in what little work exists, the general distaste for the book. Critics call it, quote, often incoherent, extremely callow, sorry, that's so small, I apologize. And a text in which calm judicial good humor was lost in acerbic bitterness. It's true that Twain spends 362 pages attacking a single religious institution. So perhaps the book is tiresome and obsessive, though aren't many literary scholars about their subjects. This paper will attempt to find the value in obsessively reading an organization's inner workings. I argue that the book serves as an educational exercise in teaching readers how one might apply those skills. The book metacritically argues that when we do read the bylaws, we can be social critics. Further, Twain's critique of the church's structure reveals broader points about his mode of attack on monopoly, specifically the way corporations from the Christian Science Church to electrical companies to the Belgian monarchy accumulate power via knowledge systems to the detriment of their publics. Okay. What work does exist on the book often comes from a feminist tradition, and in fact notices the gendered way Twain deals with the powerful feminine leader of Christian Science, Mary Baker G. Eddy. Peter Stoneley in Mark Twain and the Feminist Aesthetic reads the text for Twain's prejudices. At one point, he parses Twain's line, quote, "Men are usually competent thinkers," to point out Twain's near explicit misogyny. Readings like this build toward a broader point that while Twain was, quote, susceptible to the romance and sentiment offered by the feminine aesthetic, he also rejected it as pretentious, non-functional, and un-American, end quote. In other words, the anti-feminine subtext encompasses both Twain's diction and also his line of attack. Twain's emphasis on his target's gender may have allowed him to displace broader critiques about consolidating power in American life onto Eddy. Stoneley makes this point well about Henry Huddleston Rogers, a business tycoon associated with Standard Oil and a good friend of Twain's later years. Stoneley writes, and Rogers saves Twain from the typesetter fiasco, etc., etc. Stoneley writes that Twain's personal indebtedness to Rogers for help received in his business affairs prevented him from criticizing his friend in print, and that Christian Science was a sort of criticism à clef that he vilified Eddy for the trust elements of her organization, which I think I agree with. In other words, Eddy was an easier target because of her femininity onto which to project Twain's distaste for his own friend's business practices. This strikes me as convincing with respect to Twain's many relationships with figures of power and his representation of the ethics of relating to power one knows is gotten by immoral means. In American Claimant, for example, the protagonist comments on a radical working men's meeting with his friend Barrow. Barrow uses the language of human nature to express his disagreement with the logic of the radical speech that places much of the blame for the wealth inequality in Britain on British royalty. Barrow complains about, quote, the leaving out of the factor of human nature, requiring another man to do what you wouldn't do yourself. That is, if anyone inherited wealth, if any of us inherited wealth, maybe, it's human nature that we would take it. Or in other words, the system that allows the British royalty to exist is at fault, not the individual royals who squat over their wealth. Quote, you have no blame for the lucky few who naturally decline to vacate the pleasant nest they were born into. You only despise the all-powerful and stupid mass of the nation for allowing the nest to exist, end quote. While Twain's late career radical politics at first seem incongruous with his friendships with robber barons like Rogers, the explanation does have an internal logic. Twain is less interested in blaming rich and powerful people for not withdrawing from immorally obtained wealth than he is in blaming the poor for not seizing their rightful due. Increasingly, this discourse of human nature is the same that novelists like Edward Bellamy, William Dean Howells, Twain himself in Connecticut Yankee, employ in their scientifically minded utopias published around the same time, and which Twain certainly read. Howells was here at Quarry Farm, etc. I think Twain read both of these novels maybe when he was here. Okay, Howells, Bellamy, and Twain are all concerned with the question of blame for monopolistic capitalism. Is it the fault of the individuals at the top for accumulating wealth, or is it the fault of the masses for letting them do it? Eddy represents an easier gendered target onto which Twain can displace criticism of his friend Roger and other capitalists like him, and even a sublimated criticism of himself, as John Tuckey puts it, quote, it is hard to escape the impression that Clemens's aversion to Mrs. Eddy had behind it something of the feeling one has toward a successful rival. Throughout this book, Twain maintains a grudging respect for Eddy and her religion, even as he's attacking her. But I want to argue that in general terms, Twain attacks the monopolistic structures written into the Christian Science church bylaws almost as much, if not more, than he does the personalities. From early in the book, Twain distinguishes Christian Science from a group of pseudosciences mentioned at the beginning, such as the wild medicine man, the educated physician, the mesmerist, and the hypnotist, who have made of us the client's imagination. In contrast, Christian Science has an ability for large-scale organization. He elaborates with an extended metaphor, and this is this quote. Quote, the Christian Scientist has organized the business. Electricity, in limitless volume, has existed in the air and the rocks and the earth and everywhere since time began, and was going to waste all the while. In our time, we have organized that scattered and wandering force and set it to work and backed the business with capital and concentrated it in a few and competent hands, and the results are as we see. Kind of an ominous as we see. The literal explanation reflects praise on Eddy's, at first seems to reflect praise on Eddy's Christian Science movement. Eddy, like the electrical companies, provides a service by harnessing via an organization the power of imaginative healing. But just as these two halves of the metaphor seem at first linked by positive connotations, they are also linked by negative connotations. Twain's attacks on Christian Science's consolidation of power and wealth reflect back onto the consolidation of power and wealth via science by the electrical companies. But here we are still operating at a general metaphoric level, of the conceptual analogy between the Christian Science Church and monopolistic electrical companies. What I really want to talk about is the long central chapter of Christian Science in which Twain does an extended close reading of the church's bylaws, quoting them dozens of times at length. Twain introduces this reading by saying, quote, "In these laws for the government of her church," and he's obviously being sarcastic, "in the government of her church, her empire, her despotism, Mrs. Eddy's character is embalmed for good and all. I think a particularized examination of these church laws will be found interesting," end quote. Over the next 65 pages, Twain proceeds on an extended reading where his thesis is almost less that the bylaws demonstrate Eddy's character than that their structure, which looks at first like a democratic republic with checks and balances, in fact preserves the autocratic power of a single person interested in simply accumulating more power and money. As I've stated earlier, this can of course be applied to the corporate and governmental structures of American life. For example, notice the implicit analogy to the US Constitution when Twain writes, sorry, this is so small, but I'll read it. "When Article 1 speaks of a president and board of directors, you think you have discovered a formidable check upon the powers and ambitions of the honorary pastor, the pastor emeritus," Mary Eddy. "But it is a mistake. The board is of so little consequence that the bylaws do not state how it is chosen, nor what it does. But they do state, most definitely, that the board cannot fill a vacancy in its number except the candidate is approved by the pastor emeritus," end quote. In other words, what seems to be the checks and balances of a responsible organization is revealed to be the smoke and mirrors of a monarch. The next few dozen pages support the point with many additional readings of the bylaws. Literally 65 pages on bylaws. Twain presents multiple lists of officials in the church who are, in fact, accountable only to Eddy herself. But at the end of that initial 65 pages, the argument then moves from political power to financial power. Twain describes Eddy's profit on her book as, quote, "a $3 book that is made for 35 or 40 cents in large editions, but for which she doesn't have to pay the author, the middleman, and advertising." In other words, Eddy makes 700% margin on the cost. Further, Twain introduces Eddy's edict that, quote, "it shall be the duty of all Christian scientists to circulate and to sell as many of these books as they can," end quote, "and moreover, if they violate the rule, they will face excommunication." Eddy uses the power of her seemingly restrained but actually despotic church structure to force members to do unpaid advertising and selling on a book she makes 7 times the cost of in profit. In other words, Twain pairs a financial literacy reading with a close reading of the proclamation to show how Eddy's internal governance works also toward her financial margins. I have to say, when I first read the text, I read it looking for Twain's relationship with the ideologies of Christian Science, which was sort of the direction of my dissertation. In the context of my focus on pseudoscience, I was curious to understand what Twain thought about the practices and not the bureaucracy of Christian Science. In other words, what did he think about its mysticism, its imaginative potential, his daughter's engagement with Christian Science directly? But I came away from reading this book much more fascinated by, well, I'm still also interested in that's not true. I'm interested in the Christian Science part too. But I'm also fascinated with Twain's ability to do an excellent close reading, decades before the new critics, and moreover, a close reading with a high social and political stakes. I started with this conceptual question, but I came away realizing the same kind of prose that I assigned to my students, namely a close reading of something, except with the humor and skill of one of the best American writers. Because of the limits of time, I will stop doing the close reading of Twain's close reading, but suffice it to say, you should read the book yourself. It's interesting and it's fun. To zoom out a bit, Twain makes a related attack on the imperial structures of colonialism, especially in his work King Leopold's Soliloquy, published shortly before this book and during his period of obsession with Eddy. The two critiques of Christian Science and imperialism are linked on a broad level because of their ambivalence toward attacking the central figure, Mary Eddy and King Leopold, in favor of shifting the blame toward the nuances of the bureaucratic. With respect to imperialism, Twain not only attacks the Belgian monarchy directly, but those complicit, including the United States government, which propped up the Belgian project under the pretense of reform. Twain writes of the United States, quote, "Our vain republic is the only democracy in history that has lent its power and influence to the establishing of an absolute monarchy," end quote. Twain further talks about how the US president was the first to salute the Belgian flag of Congo imperialism, and then quotes the President's Order of Recognition Act of 1884. He's drawing our attention not just to the hypocrisy of the, ostensibly democratic government supporting a monarchy, but also to the mundane details of intergovernmental imperial corporation. To conclude, Twain's scientifically minded nonfiction of his later years appear at first to be obsessive and boring, and then, if not boring, polemic. But because we again find ourselves in an age of corporate capitalism and corporate imperialism, where the value of higher humanities education is at stake, these are critiques worth returning to and taking seriously. Twain gives us a model for how literary critics can apply our skills to expose the big problems of electrical, religious, and imperial despotism via the details of language. We don't have to start our critiques at a global or conceptual level. We can try, for example, to read the bylaws of the organizations that are destroying our planet, etc., and doing imperialism, etc., etc. And by close reading those bylaws, we can fashion some powerful critiques. Thanks.